Well, the setup is very complicated now. It's not going to be just any old presidential election. With the pro-Russian control over the eastern parts of Ukraine, we now have a People's Republic of Donetsk and a People's Republic of Luhansk. And in both those, the local activists are talking about holding a referendum on May 11. That's 2 weeks before the presidential election. And that referendum, depending on who you listen to, will be a two-stage process. One, whether those parts of Ukraine should be autonomous, and the second stage, whether they should be annexed to the Russian Federation. It's very difficult to say what is going to happen because the opinion polls that we have access to are now old. And old now means several weeks old. And things on the ground are moving so quickly that the impact on voters is difficult to assess. But it's not going to be a lot of people voting in favor of independence here. So that vote will obviously be spun by the pro-Russian media as a big victory for independence for these parts. What will follow after the referendum is that Kiev will not recognize it as legal, and the outside world in the West will not recognize these as legal. The question is what the Russians will do, and that's the big question, obviously. When it comes to the presidential election on May 25, there are opinion polls on saying who is the front runner, and those may be credible when it comes to the central parts of Ukraine. But if no presidential election can be held in Donetsk and Luhansk, if it's going to be an iffy thing in Kharkiv, and if it's going to be an iffy thing in Odessa, then the Kremlin has achieved its main objective, namely that there is no way that this presidential election is going to come out looking in any way, form, or shape as a legitimate election. And that has been the main objective of the Kremlin all along, to destabilize Ukraine to the point where they don't have a legitimate leadership. And they're winning that struggle now. Well, that is very difficult to say at the moment. When they annexed Crimea, nobody thought that they would actually do that. Most observers believed that Crimea would become another frozen conflict, if you wish, like South Ossetia and Abkhazia in Georgia, or like Transnistria in Moldova, parts that are de facto controlled by Russia, but not recognized by anybody else. The fact that they actually did annex Crimea may be a special case because Crimea is so special to the Russians. Whether they actually will go ahead and annex Donetsk and Luhansk, it's obviously possible, but I would still believe that this is not a very likely option. Having the leverage of controlled areas within Ukraine seems, from a rational point of view, to be preferable for the Kremlin. But given what they did in Crimea, you never know. So destabilizing Ukraine, opting for some sort of federalization, constitutional rewrite, where some parts of Ukraine have de facto or even de jure rights to conduct their own foreign policies with Russia. That's going to be the likely outcome. Then obviously we have the case of Transnistria, the breakaway part of Moldova that is now squeezed between Ukraine and Moldova with a very large Russian military garrison. And it's likely that the lethal fire in Odessa was partly triggered by pro-Russian activists arriving from Transnistria to kick up trouble in Odessa. I mean, not they setting the fire, but the context of street violence is brought about by activists from Transnistria. So that is now part of the Ukrainian imbroglio, and it does not look very promising for the future. Well, it means quite a lot for the West. What Russia has demonstrated now is that what we believe to be the new world order after the Cold War the inviolability of international borders and the Budapest Agreement that Russia signed to respect the territorial integrity of Ukraine. All these agreements have now been voided by Mr. Putin. He literally drove a tank over all of it. And exactly what is going to come out of this is very, very hazy at the moment. It all depends on how far, what is enough for the Kremlin? How far are they intending to push this? Are they going to, having de facto dismembered Ukraine, will they do the same in Kazakhstan, where the northern part of Kazakhstan is 50% ethnic Russians? And according to the Russian Federation Constitution, they claim that they have a right and a duty to protect with military force Russian speakers in other countries. So Kazakhstan may be in the line of fire. And the Baltic republics, especially Estonia and Latvia, that have sizable Russian-speaking minorities, may also be in the line of fire. So to the West and to NATO in particular, this is a completely novel and not a very happy situation where, NATO is militarily very superior to the Russian army. Even without the Americans, the European part of NATO is superior to the Russian army. But if you don't have the guts to use the army, that doesn't help very much. And if Russia were to kick up trouble in Kazakhstan or in the Baltic republics in the manner they've done in Ukraine, with pro-Russian activists in uniforms without insignia, that is not something you can counter with military force. So when NATO members like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania call for consultations according to Article 4, looking at Article 5 on collective defense, that is not designed to deal with these types of terror destabilization operations that the Russians are conducting at the moment. So we really don't have an antidote for what the Russians are up to at the moment. And this is the new world that we are faced with now. Completely new security dilemmas and security challenges that the West is just not up to facing at the moment. And that is worrisome, much more worrisome than the risk of war.